Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to QuestaWeb's webinar titled Key Issues in Running a Compliant Foreign Trade Zone. I want to thank everyone for registering and attending today's event. We have quite a good number attending, and we're looking forward to a great presentation. Today's webinar is about foreign trade zones and the importance of inventory control to comply with the regulations administered by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Your takeaways from this webinar will include why an FTZ is the most flexible CBP bonded facility program, what operations may be performed in an FTZ, what documentation CBP requires, and how compliance is all about the data you maintain and file with CBP. We will set aside 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for responding to questions. On the control panel, you will notice a box titled Questions. Below it is a box reading Type Questions Here. Feel free to type in your questions as they occur throughout the webinar. We will try to answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. I am Eric Dalby, Director of FTZ Implementations at QuestaWeb Incorporated. QuestaWeb is a leading provider of global trade management solutions for importers, exporters, and foreign trade zone operators. Let me say up front that this webinar is not about QuestaWeb and its products. In fact, this will be the only mention of the company and its GTM and FTZ software solutions. Today, I am being joined by Trey Boring, Senior Vice President of IMS Worldwide Incorporated. The firm is an internationally recognized authority on the establishment, marketing, and operation of foreign trade zones. For over 36 years, IMS Worldwide has provided advice as well as application and activation assistance across ports nationwide. Notably, IMS Worldwide pioneered the multi-site zone concept and established the first of its kind in Houston in 1981. Today, this approach is now the industry standard for designing a successful FTZ. As Senior Vice President, Trey leads IMS Worldwide's foreign trade zone practice and spearheads business development. His expertise spans multiple business verticals, including large equipment, appliance, high-tech manufacturing, as well as national and regional distribution centers for apparel, consumer goods, equipment, electronics, and flooring and tile. Trey's in-depth grasp of the federal regulations governing FTZ operations serves to assure regulatory compliance when implementing manufacturing and warehouse management systems, as well as record-keeping and inventory control that support across-the-board compliance. Trey holds a Master of Business Administration degree and possesses significant experience in production, marketing, project management, and logistics. He currently serves as the chairman of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones and is a member of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals and the International Compliance Professional Association. I am both proud and pleased to have him with us today. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome Trey.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that introduction. Looking forward to a great discussion today on foreign trade zones with everyone.
Okay. Let's begin our webinar with a poll question. Where do you stand relative to a foreign trade zone? Do you already have a zone in operation? Are you considering creating a zone? Or are you interested in the topic of zones in general? Please respond now by selecting your answer and submitting.
All right, Eric, it looks like we have quite a few folks here that are already in zone operations, and then quite a few that are just interested in the topic in general. So that's good. I appreciate it. We'll kind of tailor our comments for you as we go through the presentation. So what we'll do as we start off today is I just want to make sure that those of you that are interested in the topic and those of you considering a foreign trade zone have a good baseline of introductory knowledge on foreign trade zones in general. So what I wanted to show you here is basically a definition that is fairly standard for what a foreign trade zone is. And basically, if you've been around the program at all, you know that it's an area that's within the United States that has a geographic boundary that's been approved to be outside of the customs territory. Now that's just very, fancy language for saying it's outside of the entry process or the duty collection process. Items get to be brought into a foreign trade zone. They can be manipulated through various activities that are approved, and your customs duty is determined when that merchandise leaves the zone. So that's really a basic definition. It's almost like a business island within the center of the United States, if you will, that has been pre-approved. So that's kind of the simplest definition I can give everybody on what a foreign trade zone is. So we all figure out, all right, we're in a foreign trade zone. What does it do? How does it work? Is always a question that we end up addressing with companies that are considering the program. So, what I want to be able to go over with you today is the basics of how a foreign trade zone does function. And the key elements that I want to talk about today are inventory control, customs documentation, and then customs compliance. Now, inventory control is very simple, and I use that term in a very simplistic and overreaching way, because inventory control answers a couple of key questions for you and for Customs and Border Protection if you're running your foreign trade zone. First, the inventory control system has to tell you what your zone has in it. What merchandise do I have in it? What types of merchandise? The amount of merchandise that I have. All of those answers are what have to be provided in a foreign trade zone relative to customs management of the foreign trade zone program within your operation. As we mentioned on the previous slide, you are given the opportunity to manage an area where goods can be brought in and come to rest in your facility for you to process without you having paid duty. So Customs is really interested in knowing what have you done with the product, what's there, because you haven't paid your tax on it yet, right? You're holding their money, the tax money, so they want to make sure you can account for it. And the other element to that is obviously, what do I do with the merchandise? Obviously, I receive it and I ship it, but how do I manipulate it? What are some of the manipulations that I perform? Do I re-tag merchandise? Do I kit merchandise? And in any of these processes, do I conduct an activity that would raise itself to manufacturing or production within the foreign trade zone definition? Am I manipulating enough of the merchandise so that it changes its status or changes its tariff classification so that I would then qualify for a manufacturing or a production operation? And the inventory control system has to be able to track what you do with merchandise, no matter what activities you undertake in a foreign trade zone. The other thing is customs documentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the inbound documentation required when you're bringing things into the zone, and the outbound documentation, obviously, that has to be processed. And the main element of customs compliance really is the answer to this one very simple question here, and that is, can I explain to CBP what happened to my merchandise? Can I draw a conclusion for them that shows merchandise coming into my facility, running through my activities, and going out of my facility? And can I show them that in a format that they understand?
Okay, let's gather a little more information from today's attendees on their FTZ use or vision for an FTZ. How are you currently using your zone, or for what purposes are you interested in creating a zone? For distribution, for manufacturing, for kitting, or repacking, manipulating, testing? Please respond now by selecting your answer and submitting.
Okay, well, we've got almost an even split between distribution and manufacturing, it looks like, on the poll responses, so that's good. We'll go through and make sure we cover enough on each subject for everyone. Okay, so basically we've talked about what a foreign trade zone is and how it functions. in relative to how we would process and run through merchandise in a foreign trade zone. But the types of activities that I've mentioned, people tend to ask a lot, well, what really is allowable in a foreign trade zone? And the answer is just about anything you can do in your regular business with the right approvals is able to be done in a foreign trade zone. We have here on the slide, distribution, storage, testing, repackaging, manufacturing, repair, assembly. It really is a broad section of activities that can be undertaken in a foreign trade zone. And the idea here is that the program is designed to be that free for you when you're running a foreign trade zone, so that you can do the operations that fit what your normal processes do in your facility.
So Trey, you mentioned those are normal processes. So companies are already performing these in their facilities today. So why would they be interested in establishing a foreign trade zone?
Well, that's a good question, Eric. Basically, what you're looking at in the foreign trade zone goes back to our definition of the program, which is I can bring things in without the payment of duty. So, all of these activities can be done in someone's facility today, but they've paid duty. They've paid duty at the port where it's come in, or the airport where it's landed, or the border crossing where the truck or the rail has come across. In a foreign trade zone, what I'm allowed to do is not make that payment there at the border and bring these products into my facility and have that entire process covered on not having paid duty on those items, so that what I get to do with those items while they're in my facility can help me determine when I actually pay. So you get a lot of the benefits that are the duty-related benefits of duty deferral, paying when it leaves my facility as opposed to before it even arrives. You get the manipulation and manufacturing benefits that are available if you qualify for actually changing the nature of a product. I bring in components, build something, I can choose the lowest duty rate for the item that I imported and apply that duty rate to that item. So it's that management of that duty and the management of that entry process that really is why companies do this. And again, the freedom of the program, it allows them to do it without a whole lot of interference. So let's talk about inventory control here for just a moment. Basically, what we look for is a stair-step method when we're talking about inventory control. So I'm going to start at the beginning. We call it admission, or merchandise admitted to the zone. And for everyone, that can be very simply translated as to receiving. It is when the goods come into your facility is where you draw the parallel with zone admission, because admission is the receipt of the merchandise into the zone. So a couple of things that you look for in your inventory control process, and number one is the import documentation. As I mentioned just a second ago, Eric, we're not paying our duty at the border. We're paying our duty later on in the process. So therefore, in order to close out customs documentation, I have to have the import documentation provided on my admission document, my 214, when I file it to receive the goods in. And on top of that, I need a way that I can tell customs, rest assured, I checked the merchandise and the count is right, and this is what I brought into the zone, and this is what I expected. Any variances, you would certainly, make those noted, but you have to have a physical accounting of that merchandise when it comes through your facility. And the other thing is a compliance review of both the merchandise and the documentation. I mean, it goes to the point of, did I get everything I expected? Did my vendor, which I know never happens, did my vendor send me the wrong invoice? And the products that are on this container aren't the ones on this invoice, and the invoice I'm looking for is on the other container, which has this product. I mean, simple things like that happen. You have to be able to review those and offer a compliant solution, which the foreign trade zone allows you to do. The other is the physical movement of the merchandise. When you're dealing with inventory control, you really have two things. One is the establishment of data and establishment of things like value and tariff classification. a country of origin, mid-code, all of those elements of data that will be required later on when you make entry. You have to be able to create those and generate those within your system. But the other thing is you have to be able to track where the merchandise goes, because customs wants to know, what have you done with the merchandise I let you bring in duty-free? So once we have things received, one of the other things we like to kind of focus on are the cycle count or annual inventory, which you have a choice of selecting either or by customs, or through the customs regs, I should say. And most people, because physically in their operations today they do cycle counts, most folks will select a cycle count. But basically what you have to provide for customs is a guarantee that while things are in your trusted care, without having duty paid on them, that you are counting that merchandise at least once a year. That's the regulatory requirement. And you can do that through shutting your facility down, doing one big annual inventory where you can invite customs out to watch it and be there and participate with you, or you can do the continuous cycle count process and just report variances as they occur. But either way, it is a critical element, because you have to prove again to customs that the merchandise that they have placed in your care without the payment of duty is being accounted for.
Okay. So far, the inventory control seems straightforward, but can you tell me what are some of the common issues that you run into regarding inventory control?
Well, the interesting thing is you run into issues that are data related a lot of times. People that don't have the right way to get their import documentation in. You get, a lot of times you'll get value discrepancies and things of that nature. And the other element is just pure and simple. It's what you deal with in any warehouse. Somebody on the dock didn't quite count everything correctly, so we find out during a cycle count process, 6 weeks later that, well, we didn't get all 1,000 pieces we expected. We got 750. And, at that point in time, it's an issue, because how do you prove to customs that, I didn't have the 1,000 the first time, sorry, we made a mistake, right? You have to go through looking at, accuracy at the beginning. The other is case concealed shortages. You get that a lot. I mean, where, a box is marked, said to contain 100 pieces. You don't know it till you open it and you find out there's only 50. I mean, those are some of the common inventory control issues. The main things that happen, however, for folks that are the most, I guess I would say, crucial, is how your inventory control systems, such as your warehouse management or your manufacturing system, communicate to any zone software system that you have. You have to always make sure you are capturing transactions, because the biggest things that we end up getting involved in from a compliance standpoint tend to be more about, not the two systems not being able to track everything. So, you either have more inventory than you really do because the transactions aren't being communicated, or you have less inventory than you're supposed to because the transactions aren't being communicated. So the larger the zone you run and the more complicated your systems are and the linkages between those systems, that's where a lot of care has to be taken. So let's look again at inventory control. We've got our cycle counting we've talked about. Let's talk about our activities. What do I do with my merchandise and the manipulations that you have, repackaging, picking, packing, inspecting, in some cases some repairs. And by repair you can also include, reticketing or country of origin marking corrections, all of the types of manipulations that are approvable in a foreign trade zone. And what you have to have in your inventory control system is a traceability for what you did with that merchandise. So within your inventory control process, your warehouse management system, if you create work orders to do repackaging, or you have a pick list that's transmitted to the floor for picking to be done, maybe it's transmitted to a gun, or somebody's walking around with a piece of paper, depending on how complicated your processes are. That person is, that traceability of those reports need to be there for justification to customs should you be involved in an audit, and they want to know, what have you done with all the merchandise. But managing those manipulations is one element that's very critical. The other is when you talk about manufacturing or production. This is where it gets really, really critical, because my manufacturing system then needs to be able to communicate to any zone software that I'm using the transactions that are going on within the system, such as I've got a bill of material, and this bill of material contains 5 item A's and 5 item B's, and when I bring them together, I put C, D, E, and F that are going into this thing, and at the end of the day, I've got a widget that comes out the back end of my assembly line. Well, we have to be able to track that bill of material, the issues from inventory to the work in process, or WIP inventory, so that I know and can justify to customs and border protection where the merchandise is in my system. Plus, at the end of the day, I still have to be able to explode that bill of material backwards and be able to tell customs, when I enter a widget, it really contains 5 of A and 5 of B, and we want to apply the value for 5A and 5Bs with the duty rate of the finished good, if that's the way our process works. So that traceability is very critical within your inventory control process, just as much as what you do for your manipulations. It's extra critical for your manufacturing, where I'm actually making something out of these items. So inventory control, we'll talk here about zone withdrawal. We've kind of followed the process, right? We talked about receiving, or zone admission. We talked about inventory control, which is the accountability that we must have with customs as you walk through your zone. And we talked about the activities. What do you do with your merchandise? Manipulations, manufacturing. Again, all of those are the inventory control elements that ultimately get us to this point here. Because, Eric, I don't know any zone whose goal it is not to ship product. I mean, everybody needs to ship their product. That's how we generate revenue for the industries that we work in, right? So as the things go out the door, a couple of things that you need to look at from an inventory control perspective and is, what do I do with my merchandise when it's leaving the zone? Is it being exported? If it's being exported, how is it being exported to where? Do I have accountability? Do I have documentation? Am I shipping it to domestic customers? If so, am I accounting for it correctly in my process? And the other, which is a little unique, is, am I only temporarily removing my inventory? Because this is where fun things occur from a foreign trade zone perspective is, let's say I have to send something out of my zone, but I want to bring it back. And it's maybe going to be painted, or it may be going to be tested. If it's going to do something but come back, I need to understand the nature of the product when it is released for this temporary removal, the approval of the activity while it's gone, and how those goods come back, because there are a myriad of ways that we could spend almost an entire hour on talking about how things can be temporarily removed. And if it qualifies, you can do this on a 216 document, which allows it to leave, have something done to it, brought back into the zone, and never have a duty payment made on it. In other cases, many operations say at that point they make entry, pay duty on something that's leaving, it goes and has an activity done to it, and it comes back, and they receive it back in as a different part number, domestic status, because they've sent it out and had something done. But you need to understand is, what do I do with that merchandise when it leaves my zone? Because that adds to your closing documentation that you have to have in a foreign trade zone. The other is, what is the nature of the merchandise leaving my zone? I mean, this is a lot simpler if I'm dealing in a distribution environment where I have true boxes in and boxes out. I know that I'm bringing in product A, and product A is always going to be product A, even at the point when I send it back out to my customer. And then production is, obviously, as we've talked about here, do I have any components or raw materials that are coming in, and a finished good that is going out of my foreign trade zone? Because again, as I just mentioned above, that's going to understand, how do I take that export document or that import document and how do I make that blow back into an ability to trace what foreign components went into what I'm actually shipping. And then the other is the big question, how do I withdraw my merchandise? I'm using the documentation of a 7512 IE or TNE when I'm doing an export, and that just basically is the filing of that in-bond document in the QP system showing that I am either immediately exporting something, I'm at the port and I'm sending it right over to a ship and it's going on the ship and it's going away, or am I transferring it? Am I based in the Midwest and then am I shipping it down to the port of Houston to get on a ship to go out? So I would have to transport and export that merchandise, which is the TNE. But I have to understand that because that document is what closes my liability with customs for the merchandise that's on that shipment. And the other is an 06 consumption entry, and this is the consumption entry of actually paying my duty for goods that I'm shipping into the United States. And how you withdraw the merchandise is the way you close this loop that you are responsible for, this audit trail that is created from admission or receipt all the way through to this withdrawal of the merchandise, so that I make an entry, and that entry is either an export entry or it's a consumption entry, but I've got something that closes the loop for me so that I can prove to Customs and Border Protection what happened to that merchandise after it flowed through to this end of the process.
Okay, so in keeping with the theme of inventory control and all of this traceability, let's do another poll for our audience having to do with inventory management practices. How are you managing or planning to manage inventory in your FTZ? Using an existing vendor software, an internally developed system, spreadsheets, or a completely manual paper process? Please respond now by selecting your answer and then submitting.
Okay, it looks like a large percentage of our respondents do use an existing FTZ software, but we do have quite a few that do an internally developed system, and I see that there's a few of us that still do some spreadsheets and manual processes, which are all fine and good because the size of your operation is really what drives the necessity for how complicated you make your inventory control and record keeping system. All right, so we've kind of walked through the ICRS, or the Inventory Control Record Keeping System that CBP requires us to do. So let's talk a little bit about our customs documentation, because this is another element of compliance, Eric, that we always find interesting and potential landmines, if you will, for some folks. But on the inbound, when we talk about our zone admission, we talk about what needs to be recorded, country of origin, mid-code, commercial invoice value, those types of things are relative to what we have to look at on inbound documentation to our foreign trade zone. If you're an inland zone, you have potentially a 7512 IT, inbound transport document. So let's say, again, I'm in the Midwest, goods arrive at the port of Houston, they jump on a truck and they come all the way up to my zone. It's going to travel to me on an inbound transport document, an IT. And with that, because what I would normally have used in Houston, in my example here, to pay duty is a commercial invoice. I would have had to close out the ocean bill or the air bill, however it came into the country. I would potentially have my packing list and other information telling me what's on the shipment, but I would be using those two elements, especially the commercial invoice, the bill of lading information, to make entry in Houston if I wasn't a foreign trade zone. So those are critical data elements that have to come forward now, because I didn't close those documents out with an entry. I closed the bill of lading process so I can get it off of the ship with a 7512 that says it's going to my zone, and therefore that 214 that I cut has to close the loop again on the data and the information that is being provided by my freight forwarder and or my broker and or the shipping line to customs, and that I have to close the loop knowing that I need to tell Customs and Border Protection that all that merchandise you have in bond that nobody's paid tax on, my 214 basically tells Customs it's here. I have it. I'm responsible for it. And that document package is what you need to set up as your inbound or your 214 file. And the data elements involved in all of these documents are critical to laying a good groundwork on your inventory control process. So a couple of questions are from most people is, well, that's good. I need that documentation, but how do I get that fed into my system if I'm using a third-party FTZ software or an internally devised solution? How do I get that data in my system? And in most cases, you're looking at really the wonderful two options. And I know these are very generic, and as people are looking at the slides, they're probably going, big deal, whoop-de-doo, you told us what we already knew. But it's electronically fed or manually input. That's really the two main ways that you can get this information plugged in. And I wish I had a magic pill to give everybody and say there's a third way or a magic way to make either one of these work great. But these are very specific, and they're going to be very specific to your business operation and your functionality. I deal with companies every day that are large enough to be able to have somebody feed all this data via EDI, and others that pay people to key data. And it's just one of those things that's where this information has to come from these documents, and it has to get into the system, and it's going to get into the system in one of these two ways.
It does sound like a lot of data that you have to gather, though.
Absolutely, and it's critical data because that mid-code, country of origin, the value, all of those things you have to have on the back end when you make your entry. All right, now while goods are in the zone, you will probably experience the use of a couple of other customs documents, and these customs documents will need to be managed and maintained. What we talked about a little bit earlier was that temporary removal, but the 216 document. Now, this is the same document that is generally used by zones on an annual basis to get a blanket approval for their simple manipulations that they're approved for. But this item is also used to account for items that are leaving the zone or removed from the zone, and either on a temporary removal basis, as the example we gave a little bit earlier, a piece leaves the zone and it's going to come back and I'm going to maintain my bonded status, or, and more commonly, for destruction. The 216 is what I would use to destroy merchandise. I have things come in, they're non-sellable, I've gone through my process with customs and identified how they need to be destroyed, and I'm going to go destroy them. And I need the 216 to close that loop again in my inventory control system. So that 216 is how you define what has been removed. And if you're doing it under an approved destruction process with customs, you're not paying duty on those items either. So it's a very important document if you have some benefit relative to that. The other is the 214, the same document we use for a zone admission. You may run across in your cycle counting process where I found 5 items. I thought that we had shipped them. I don't know where they came from. I did a complete inventory of this item in my facility, and I have made the determination that I have magically increased my inventory by 5. The systems don't show it, so I've got to add them to the systems. So I'll make an adjustment, positive adjustment to the system, which will then mean I am required to put that positive adjustment on a 214 because, once again, I need to go tell customs what I have in my zone. So if it's a foreign status item that I have and I increased my inventory by 5 magically or through some mistake, either way, I've got to notify customs I'm adding 5 to my zone liability. And the same thing goes with an 06 consumption entry. For negative adjustments. If you're using, depending on how you're using your consumption entry, either weekly or on demand, you have to, in some manner or form, in either one of those cases, account for negative adjustments, because the opposite could just be just as true as my example for the positive. I walked around, I check my inventory. I have lost 5 pieces, don't know how. They've magically poofed and disappeared into thin air. We can't understand what's happened to them, but I know they're gone. Now, when they're gone and I make an adjustment in my inventory through my inventory control system, I am then going to have to communicate to customs that those 5 pieces are gone. And how do I do that? Well, I can't convince them that I don't know where they went, so they went export. I don't want to pay duty, right? No. Customs says you lost them. We're assuming you lost them into the United States. You're going to pay duty. And so that is where that 06 consumption entry for negative adjustments comes in. But again, you have to have this traceability because that, again, helps you close the loop on those items. Withdrawal from the zone, and we talked a little bit about these when we were talking about the back end of our inventory control system, but withdrawal from the zone, you can see here, 06 consumption entry. You know, we can do an individual or weekly entry. And depending on how you set up the process, you have to then be able to manage a file with those consumption entries so that you can show and prove to customs in your audit trail that I have closed that loop on my merchandise that's been held in my zone. The other is the 7512. You have to have a 7512 for every single export that you send out. So if I've got a trailer load that is going to go to Canada, and it's my weekly trailer load to Canada, I've got a 7512 exportation document that is going to have my goods leave from my facility and go to Canada, and that 7512 closes at the border when that trailer has crossed and goes into Canada. Well, I have to have all that paperwork and documentation because, again, that closes the loop on my inventory control process for CBP with proof of exportation. And we talked a little bit earlier about the 2 types of exportation. If I'm in the Port of Houston and I'm going to go put this on a ship to go export, it's an immediate export. If I am in St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm shipping this down to Houston to go on a ship, it is that transportation and exportation. In either case, we have to have copies of that document because that is the only thing that closes the loop for us to show proof of exportation so we don't have to pay duty on those items that we've just sent export. So your accounting of your merchandise when you're withdrawing from the zone, you know, this sounds kind of simplistic here, Eric, when I say this, but you have to document what you're withdrawing from your zone through your inventory control process. That means you have to have a good record of the item and how much actually left the foreign trade zone. Now, I make that point even though it sounds so simple, because it is an element of your inventory control and your audit trail. In foreign trade zones, most people will manage their inventory by that item number and or by a shipment through what's called a lot system. But in most cases, you've got this item number, and I got to know how much of it went out and when it went out, and it's all driven by that item. Well, even if you're using a zone lot system or a shipment system, if you're only going to ship half of it out, you need to know what items and how much of them went out if you're not shipping out that whole lot of product all at one time. So it is critical that you have that audit trail within your inventory control system for this withdrawal to go along with the documentation for that withdrawal.
Okay, so even under the customs documentation section, which you're on now, you keep referring back to inventory control. So if the focus of the zone is so heavily on inventory control, should the warehouse side of the business be the one that's designated to manage the FTZ?
You know, it really depends. You know, we have a lot of inventory control people that are trained to run zones and do a very, very good job. We also have some customs compliance people that are trained to run zones and do a very, very good job. What I always tell everyone is a knowledge of how you handle your inventory and a knowledge of your inventory control process tend to be the key element of what I look for when I'm helping a client decide who's going to run their zone. Because even if it is somebody from customs compliance, they have to understand how product flows, what happens to it in the warehouse, and the ability to go back and do research. Because, again, if I'm not I'm not watching the product if I'm the zone administrator. I'm not watching the product every day, but if I have an imbalance between my zone software and my inventory control, my manufacturing or warehouse system, I need to be able to do that research and know what I'm talking about. So that basic knowledge of inventory control, I always say, is critical. So customs compliance. Let's talk here about a little bit about customs compliance. What we've got here is what I've been talking about and alluding to throughout this entire presentation, and that is the audit trail. Now, I sort of, make that consultant's mistake, and I throw that term around early on because I assume everybody's going to follow along. So all of you out there going, what the heck is he talking about? This is where I'll at least explain it for you. But the audit trail is what customs reviews relative to your merchandise while it has been in your zone. So it is evidence of the movement of the merchandise from the beginning to the end, or admission to withdrawal, receiving to shipping. That is what your audit trail is, and it has documents along the way that need to be maintained. Documents such as 214s for your zone admission, 7512s, 7501s. The 7512, you may have a couple because maybe there was the IT that brought it to your zone. So in your 214 file, I have one 7512 and I exported it when it left my zone, so I have a 7512 export, right? All of these documents need to be in their right place and in their right file because this is, again, evidence of the movement of the merchandise from admission to withdrawal. The other is the requirement here of the physical matching of the inventory, because what you're looking at in this audit trail is, and going back to one of my original comments, was validate your inventory. I assume this shipment has 1,000 pieces on it. When it comes into my back door, I don't need to just receive it into my zone at 1,000 pieces without someone at least doing some form of a validation or a compliance check, because if I only have 750, I may be ultimately responsible for 1,000, and it may pop up in a review by customs through an audit trail that says you physically don't have these 250 items that you told me you had. So again, that whole process of in this customs compliance is that physical accounting of the merchandise and those documents tie together in a package, if you will, that shows customs what I've done with the merchandise, what I've paid duty on, what I haven't paid duty on, and how I've dealt with the merchandise while it's in my zone. All of those things are what make up your audit trail. And the second are files. Now, in your files, you will have customs compliance. You'll have, from the issue of physical or electronic, you can actually request to do electronic, but talked about this quite a bit. Your 214 needs to have your bill of lading, commercial invoice, any inbound or inbound documentation that you have, packing list if you've got it, and then your consumption entry. I need to have my cargo release from ACE, my 7501, and my withdrawal documentation from my systems or my spreadsheets or however I'm tracking it to show what went on it. Same thing with exports. I need to be able to show the 7512 document and the withdrawal. Some of the other things that you need to look at, and I'll kind of speed up on these, but annually you also have some files that you need to maintain from a customs compliance perspective. Every year you're required to do an annual reconciliation and a systems review and an FTZ board report through your grantee. All three of those things, I always say, keep in a file and handy for customs, because customs may come in and ask you about those. Now, the interesting thing is on the reconciliation and the systems review, you're required to send a letter to customs 10 days after you finish those two things that says, hey, I've done them and they're here for your review. Now, that certification letter, customs has been asking for when they come in, and they have been telling you if you've missed it, they have been writing $1,000 fines for some folks in certain ports if they've seen it. The other thing is that blanket 216 we talked about, that one for your standard manipulation and manufacturing. But those annual things really help your customs compliance as well. So in conclusion, what I want you to walk away from here is that the foreign trade zone, while there is this level of inventory compliance and record keeping that you have to have. And for some companies, I know that can seem like a daunting task. The idea here is that the Foreign Trade Zone program is the most flexible bonded facility program. And bonded warehouses, you have to ask special permissions for certain things. There are restrictions as to, in certain classes of bonded warehouses, there's a lot of restrictions on what can be done, whereas the Foreign Trade Zone is designed to work, as I mentioned earlier, with your operation. The other thing that I want you to walk away from here is understanding that inventory control is the cornerstone for your compliance. If you do not manage your inventory correctly, you will not be able to manage your compliance correctly. The other thing is that the CBP documentation that's out there continues to move forward with the implementation of ACE. More and more of these documents are going to electronic filing. The 214 is on plan for this year to be moved over to ACE. It becomes easier to deal with these processes. And finally, what I want you to walk away from here is that CBP compliance of an FTZ is certainly all about the data. And it's about data relative to my merchandise. Because they trusted me to hold it, I need to prove to them that I can identify what's happened to it. And that's the main issue that you're dealing with in a compliance element with Customs and Border Protection.
Okay, thank you very much, Trey. Do you have any last thoughts before we wrap things up?
No, I think we'll leave some time here with questions if we have a few minutes.
Okay. So the audience has sent in some excellent questions. So I'm going to go through these and see how many we can get through in the time that we have left. The first question, if you're looking to just defer duties, what is the difference between an FTZ and a Class 2 or 3 bonded warehouse?
If you're just looking at deferring duty, I think it's the restrictions that come along with Class 2 and Class 3 bonded warehouses. Do those restrictions interfere with your commercial operation? Are they things that would be difficult for you to live with as a commercial operation? Straight up duty deferral, the biggest thing is, I can accomplish that in other programs, but it's all based on what works easily with my internal commercial operations. And I would also say that in Class 2 and Class 3, you certainly don't have the weekly entry option, which, certainly saves some paperwork and processing.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions related to time limits. Is there a time frame for reporting imported goods, the quantity of the imported goods when they come into your zone?
Yeah, that's there's a couple of answers to that question. The regulations talk about being able to, upon receipt, being able to report what you have, but they don't really define that time frame. A lot of the ports work under a 48-hour kind of rule if you're doing what's called direct delivery. A container arrives and dropped at your door, you're unloading it, they better have a 214 within 48 hours or they get a little upset with you. Now, the only true time limit that is out there is the one for general order. So if a shipment is shown as arrived at my facility and the 7512 is closed and the system shows that my firm's code has possession of the merchandise, if I don't cut a 214 within 15 days, I run the risk of a GO request. And so that's really the one thing that is a hard and fast deadline that is out there. But I generally will tell my clients, prepare to have it finished within 24 to 48 hours. You want to be as fast as possible.
Okay. The second question has to do with time limit for items being in the zone. Theoretically, could you leave them in the zone basically forever?
Yes, is the answer. There was a zone I worked with that had a shipment that had been in there for 18 years, I think was the last count. I mean, it was one of the first shipments that came into the zone. the guy went belly up and didn't pay his bill, and the warehouseman ended up getting stuck with it, and they couldn't figure out what to do with it, and it stayed in the zone for I think right around 18 years, if my memory's right.
Okay. I have another question about how accurate the inventory has to be. And before you start, let me preface this. I'll just read a quote from the question. We have inventory moving all day long, and if they audit us, it would not match 100% since things move continuously. So how accurate does the have to be? Yeah.
Well, and where that would only come into play for you is Customs walks in and they ask you to pull a 214, and you pull a 214 and they say, you have item A on that 214, tell me how many you have in the warehouse. And you can open up your warehouse management system, for example, and say, I have 1,000, and but I have 100 of them in an active pick location. So we should have 100 there, but if we go over there and there's not 100, I can go to my system and show you what was picked and be able to explain the differences of those things moving that rapidly through your system. But again, it goes back to being, knowledgeable enough about your inventory system to not just get caught going, oops, we came over here and there was only 80. It's supposed to be 100 in that location. What happened? Being able to sort of prep Customs and explain it to them, you're fine, because your day-to-day functionality is still going. At the end of the day, you can prove to them with a report that minus what was shipped, you're going to be accurate between your two systems, and you're going to be able to tell them for a fact at the end of the day what's in that zone.
Okay. You had mentioned some of the year-end or things. The systems review letter, what is typically covered in the systems review letter?
Well, that's one of those fun things. Basically, in the systems review, what you're looking for is, what have I done? What did I do this year? Did my FTZ process? What did I bring through? Did I make any major changes? A lot of times in this letter, many companies will just say, hey, we did our systems review, we didn't change anything because things are working well. But what you're always wanting to look at is the software that you use in the zone, the operational procedures that you use in the zone, and how all that impacts the functionality of the operation. And if I make any change to those two things, I want to make sure I identify it for Customs in the systems review.
Okay. Going back, this question came in when you were talking about your positive and negative adjustments. How do you account for scrap in that?
Well, scrap is something that you need to identify and work through your process for, let's say, manufacturing. If it's scrap that's generated in a manufacturing process and through your manufacturing, you're going to want to have that accounting defined within your operational procedures for that process. If it's scrap such as warehouse damage or things of that nature, there are a myriad of ways to handle it, and it basically turns around to how much money is it really worth to the company. And if it's a low value, low duty rate item, some companies may take warehouse damage and or scrap from that perspective and just put it on their entry. Hey, I ran through a box with a forklift fork and I, killed, 10 pieces. Well, those 10 pieces, I can either completely scrap through the 216 and therefore not pay duty, but do I want to, go through that process? Or if they're low value, low duty rate, then I may just want to say, I'm going to put those 10 on an entry and I go throw them away.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. And I'll just read this one verbatim to make sure that I reflect it accurately. Do other agencies such as FDA, Fish and Wildlife, EPA, DOT allow non-conforming product to be imported into an FTZ for later distribution or export to other countries?
Yes, it can be done, but it's not a blanket yes. There are some products that they probably, would restrict you from even bringing into the U.S. However, it is the issue of you're allowed to do that under the right scenarios. So, there are FDA non-conforming products that are allowed to be in an FTZ to be held for export. But again, depending on the nature of that product, it's not a blanket approval, if that makes sense.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question. Can you talk about documentation, the record keeping being scanned and stored electronically versus physical files?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that you're looking for if you're going to get approval, and you have to get approval from customs to not have cabinets of documents, filing cabinets in a room with your customs, your FTZ documents, you can request an electronic filing and electronic record keeping. Now, what will happen there is, in my experience, that most CBP officers want it to appear just like a filing cabinet. They want you to have a file that you can go to and open up, and it has every scanned document, right? And they want to do it just like if you had gone to a shelf and opened up a drawer, right? They want to be able to have that ability and traceability with the files. They want to be able to see those and see that you're keeping track of it in the same manner you would from the physical file. That's at least my experience, but you can scan your documents, save them, maintain them electronically with the right permission.
Okay. We had a lot of other good questions, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending the webinar, and I hope it's just the first of many more. Before everybody leaves, I'd like to get some feedback with one final poll. A simple poll: did you find today's webinar helpful? It's a yes or no, and select your answer and submit. And again, thank you everybody for attending, and thank you for responding to the poll.